Amen. All right. So like I say, I knew Cindy got sick earlier this week. And then, so Dan went home to be with her and to help out and all those different things. And so about Friday morning, I messaged and said, now, hey, we probably should be planning just in case you're not here. Who should we get to sub or this and that and the other? And after a conversation, I was like, you know what? Just give me your notes. I'll cover class. That's not a problem. I'll prep just in case. And so he's like, that's great. So I open it up and I see what he has planned, and I listened to last week's class again, and I hear how he ended class with what he planned, which, by the way, open up to Numbers 25. And I went, why did I agree to this? No. Numbers 25. I know he gave you the heads up last week, but if you didn't look at it, it's not a passage that we often discuss, and for reasons we'll figure out pretty quickly once we dive into it. But I already made the promise, so here we are. I'm going to stick with it. We're going to cover his material. But as any teacher would be, Dan is not super thrilled that he can't be here with you to close out this particular quarter's class. I know it's been a good discussion, and so we're going to start with kind of a review of where you've been, and that will lead us in to where we are today. So, you've been exploring Exodus, the great principles from Exodus, and that's not just, the story that was there, but it's what was there, why was it there, how does it tie into the New Testament, how does it affect us in our daily life today. And so if you don't know, we record each and every one of Dan's classes here in the auditorium. And so if there's anything you want to go back and look into, I would always encourage that. Those are available on our YouTube channel. But here's just a quick review of some of the things that you've explored so far. Number one, you learned about the Exodus, what it means to come out of, to be leaving Egyptian slavery and enter into the wilderness for a time, and all the things that go with that. So they have been brought out of something that was very negative for them in a personal sense. Now, obviously, it was a time where God grew his people, he strengthened his people, and in his own way, unbeknownst to them, he was preparing them for the next step in this journey with God. You talked a lot about exactly who God is and the names for God that were used, how he is mighty, how he is God Almighty, how he is the Holy One. And then you talked about the peculiarity of this God, especially in comparison to what they had been used to in Egypt. They had been used to the polytheism, all the many gods who had been created in various ways and were responsible for small parts of creation and small activities that they were going to be worshiped for. But Yahweh, the Israelite God, was someone who was not created. He was the creator, and he was the only one to be worshiped. And so Dan talked about that pretty extensively, because then that leads us to understanding that God is a God of distinctions, all right? Yes, we understand in the Christian context, God is the God of all, but especially at this point in time, he would call very specific people out, and he would say they need to do very specific things. He was a God of distinctions between peoples, but he would provide for his own. And throughout the book of Exodus, we see how he provides for them, both in miraculous ways of parting waters, by providing morning food, all these different things that would happen. God would continually provide because he had designated this group as his people. You then spent a lot of time talking about how God guides his people, how he makes agreements with them. Some were unilateral agreements. So this would be God saying, I will make you my people, and I'm going to rise up all these different things, these rulers. I'm going to, number your people. And all of those things were set in stone. There was nothing that people could do to change it, because God was going to make it happen through thick or thin. But there were also certain agreements he entered into with kind of an if-then statement, all right? If you do these things, then this will happen. Such as Dan spent some time in Deuteronomy 28. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord, your God, the Lord will set you high above nations. So if you worship me, then you will be set high. If you worship me, blessings will come upon you, all right? So all of that sets up, if you don't, these things won't happen. These are important things to keep in mind as we're heading towards Numbers 25. So God has some things that are going to happen no matter what, some things that you need to be in line with Him. And so that led to a discussion of exactly what holy means, what holy and set apart is. That could be a certain place, like the tabernacle. That could be certain things, like the Ark of the Covenant. That could be all these different things, but it's all built into where God's presence would be. Whether altar, tabernacle, these different wanderings, it was the certain people that were supposed to be the ones who led the worship, who provided the sacrifices, all these different things. These were holy and set apart. Again, going back to God as a peculiar God. He had very distinct things He required. And then all of that kind of culminated in some fun stories last week. Fun depending on who you were in the story, right? Okay, y'all remember the stories last week? All right, okay, good. If not, I could just play last week's lesson and then we could... No, okay, y'all are ready. All right, we're going to keep going. So last week's rebellion stories were a prime example of how when the people didn't do what God had called them to do, when they didn't recognize Him as who He was, when they didn't appreciate the distinctions He had set up and the peculiarities He wanted them to comply with, there were going to be some very negative consequences, okay? So then Dan teed up where we're going into today in Numbers 25. So this is again one of those times where he says, I want you to do something a certain way. I've set my people apart. And now if you don't live the way I've called you to, something will happen. All right? Now, I will say Numbers 25 is one of those passages you read it and it makes you a little uncomfortable, especially in the modern context where we're reading it and going, I don't like this. I don't like how it sounds. I don't like what happens. This isn't how I would want something to be carried out. But if you understand this context, again, this is why it's kind of good that you've been through this whole journey through Exodus to understand who God is. He's not petty. He's not someone who does things harshly without cause. It's all built upon an understanding and an agreement that the people have entered into. Okay? So here we go. Numbers 25. I'm just going to read it. Here we go. Verses 1 through 3. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. All right? So they've been wandering. They've been all over the desert. They've seen the magnificent things of God. They are now at the north end of the Dead Sea, kind of in the northeastern section. They literally are getting ready to cross over. Their journey has come to an end. All the trials that they have endured, all the things that they have seen God provide for them, and His magnificent deeds, they're right there on the edge of things. And with all that in mind, they begin to intermarry with the people that they've been told to not intermarry with, not even interact with, really. And then not only that, they are invited to and go to the sacrifices of these foreign gods. Now, if you were to go back through Exodus and then go back through Numbers and look at how many times God says, only sacrifice to me, only worship me, it would be a large number, and it could be many, many hours of study. So this is not a one-time thing that they heard that maybe they could be like, maybe I didn't quite understand it. Maybe I didn't get it. This was everywhere. This was the water they swam in, literally, okay? The worship of God alone. And yet, when they were invited to the sacrifices of Baal, they went. And God describes it as they were now yoked to this God, this foreign God, the one who was not the only uncreated creator God. They were now bound to Him by participating in these actions, okay? This was a very bad thing for them, but unfortunately, it's just one in a long line of many times where this was the case, all right? Like so many lessons that are learned, it's often hard to learn it the first time as much as we would like to. Even the second time, we wish we would pick it up, but sometimes it takes a few more repetitions for it really to sink in. And so here's just a couple of them. This is just another example of a stark contrast of a high followed by a low throughout this narrative story, all right? The big one that we're all really familiar with is there at Sinai. They show up at the mountain. God's up there. There's thunder. There's lightning. Moses goes up. It's a great thing. It's the first real celebration of them coming out of Egypt. But then immediately after, while Moses is coming down with the 10 Commandments, you have that story of the golden calf. And the people are now worshiping an idol. And Moses has to break it down, and he has to get onto the people, and there's a reckoning there. And all these things happen because they've interacted with God in a real way, but at the same time, they've struggled with that interaction. Then you have at Kadesh, the promised land and the 10 spies. This is the first time they got really close to the land. They could have entered in. They could see it. They could literally touch it, taste it, feel it, all right? The spies came back and they went, look at all the produce that's there. Look at all the great things. It's a land of milk and honey. But there's some people that we don't think we can overcome. So they literally get to see God's promised land, but they're not ready for it, and they reject it. And because of that, that's why they now are stuck wandering the wilderness for all these years, and a whole generation of people must be gone before God's ready to bring them back in. But now we're there again. It's a new generation. They're right on the edge. They're here at Peor, and we faltered. So I want you to see the high and the low here, okay? Most of us, if we're used to this story, we probably heard it more as the kid's story about the talking donkey, okay? Do y'all remember that story? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. We like that story. That's fun. It's fun to tell kids about a talking donkey. It's kind of funny. You know, oh, he crushed his rider's leg and the rider got mad and starts hitting the donkey. And then the donkey's like, why are you hitting me? You know, it's a fun story. We like that part. Okay. But that's the lead up to some other really more important things that are happening in the story. This story is when a foreign leader wanted to call a prophet to curse the people of Israel. He saw this massive nation coming, strong people with tons of livestock. So this is a strong nation that has now entered his territory. He's very worried about them. And so he calls on a prophet to stand on this high hill. And he goes, look, from where you sit, look at them. I want you to now curse their name. Well, is he able to do it? No. God uses this situation to speak blessings over his people. And so if you turn back a couple of chapters, you'll see several headings in your Bible about Balaam's first oracle, his second oracle, his third oracle, his final oracle. This wasn't a one-time try. This was over and over. The foreign king says, I need you to curse these people. I don't want them in my land. They're going to crush me. I don't want to deal with this. I need you to do something about it. And God, through this prophet, says, no, that's not how this is going to work. Just a couple of highlights through here. If you look at chapter 23, verse 19. 23, verse 19, the prophet says, God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and will not do it? Has he spoken and will he not fulfill it? Sounds pretty familiar to what we've learned so far about God, isn't it? Okay? He is a God who has made promises that he will fulfill, and nothing can shake them for his eternal promises. Those things that have been unequivocal, those are going to happen no matter what. And then in verse 20, he continues, behold, I received a command to bless, for he has blessed, and I cannot revoke it. So God, through this prophet, is making sure even a king of an evil nation knows that when God makes a promise, it's going to happen, and no one and nothing can change it. Going down to verse 21, he has beheld the misfortune that they've been through. The Lord their God is with them. So he hasn't forsaken them. He hasn't left them. He's here with them. Going ahead to chapter 24, verse 7, we see that the kings that are coming shall be higher than all these, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So now he's not only telling him God is with them, he's giving him the promise of what's going to happen. The kingdom of Israel is going to be established. Verse 9, blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. So God again, Blessed are the people who bless my people. Cursed are the people who curse my people. And then verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel, and it will crush the forehead of Moab, and it will break down the sons of Sheth. This is kind of right in the middle of what many see as a major prophecy of the coming King David. All right, this is the establishment of the great and mighty kingdom of Israel at their heyday. So now you have him prophesying not just a coming kingdom, but a very specific and powerful kingdom, a scepter from Israel that will rule over others. That's where we're at here. Balaam's prophecy was a great moment for the people of Israel because God is revealing himself now not only to Moses, now not only to the Israelites, now not only to the priests, but to even foreign prophets and foreign kings in very real ways. And it all sounds exactly the same as the promises have been. There's nothing different happening here. God is the same to one person as he is as another. His promises are true and will hold to be steadfast. But, however, it is in that moment, it is right after these amazing prophecies are given, this time where someone who was wanting to curse Israel fails miserably because God won't allow it. It is after that that we get to chapter 25. And they don't understand. They don't hear those things. And so now they begin to seek after another God. And they're enticed into it by being bound together to another people group through these marriages. Okay? Now, it's interesting to note that even though Balaam is the one making these prophecies, and Balaam says, I can't do anything against God, I can't say, at least prophesy against people of God. And in verse 25, that last verse of chapter 24, it says, Balaam rose and went back to his place, and Balak also went away. And so a lot of times, if you don't read really closely what happens next, we can go, okay, well, he failed and he went home. But apparently he gave some little bit of practical advice, so to say, to the king on his way out. Because Moses phrases it this way when he's considering what's happening. He says, behold, these women, on Balaam's advice, have caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident at Peor. And so the plague came amongst the congregation of the Lord. Somehow, whether it was kind of just the word that spread or Moses was divinely revealed that this was the case, there's almost that Balaam saying, look, I can't curse them. God won't let me curse them. But people are people. If you really want to get to somebody, you try to get them at their heart. And so somehow Balaam is still involved in this idolatry, in this breaking of God's covenant. And we could go, well, maybe that was just Moses, but it's repeated again in Revelation. So when we're being given all this information about what's happening and the curses and the warnings, from Christ through John and all these things, it says this in Revelation 2:14. You have some there who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so that they might eat the food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So there's something to it here, okay? They were pulled in by a plan from other people who wanted to do the people of Israel harm. So again, even though God's eternal plan is set in stone, like he's still going to provide, he's still going to rise up this scepter, he's going to provide the kingdom of Israel, eventually the coming Christ, all of these big picture plans, in the moment, there are still things that we can slip up and be pulled away from. And the people of Israel fell prey to one of those tricks, okay? So we have this moment where Balaam, despite all of the blessings and curses, has also brought them into this sinful moment. And so here we have, let's continue on with Numbers 25. So the Lord says to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses says to the judges of Israel, each of you kill these men who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. Ooh, it's a heavy passage. It's kind of like what Dan said last week. Sometimes you just have to report the news. I don't I don't want to try to get into the mind of God and figure out exactly why this was the necessary punishment, but it was. Especially, best I can give a look at it, if we understand how important it was for them to see God as the one and only God, the God above all gods, the God who created them, and they have entered into this agreement, there's just going to be consequences. And only God could see how deep that would run if something drastic wasn't, if some drastic measures weren't taken. All right? So I'm not going to try to explain it, but I am going to say, I trust God, I trust his judgment, and so if this is what had to happen, this is what had to happen. That may be insufficient for some people, and I want to recognize that, but that's where I am, and that's the best I can do. This is where I will add all questions can be submitted in writing to Dan Owen. No, I would be glad to talk with you later, but obviously if there are ever questions about this, because this is, all joking aside, a major question for many people, right? All right? If you haven't heard someone bring up something about the God of the Bible is vengeful, the God of the Bible is mean, the God of the Old Testament needed a nap, all these different things, it's out there. It's pretty prevalent because they read something like that, and it would be pretty common to pull that verse out and go, God told Moses to go hang people in the desert. It sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? But if we look at the whole context, it doesn't make it prettier, but it makes you go, okay, I kind of understand. They entered into an agreement. God has done amazing things, and yet these are the actions they're taking. So, we have them in this moment. They have failed to worship God. They've given themselves to another God. And so what do we do with that? Why is it there? Why do we need to learn about it? Well, like so many things y'all have discussed in this class, it's how does understanding this help us in the New Testament? How does it help us in our daily walk? And so that's where I would encourage you, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And we're going to look at several verses here for just a little bit. All right? 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He's telling them about all of these great things that have happened. He's tying together so many pieces of the story and how it impacts them as Christ followers in that moment. And so here we go, starting in verse 1. I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, verse 6. These things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. There was something about what was happening, despite them being right there on the banks of the river, ready to cross in to the promised land. There was something they felt they were still lacking. There was something that was enticing. There was something they thought, well, it's not as bad as God has said it's going to be. And so they were enticed into these evil actions. They were enticed away from God. Now, it happened to them, but like we said, we got to see 3 different examples earlier, and we could go through numerous other ones as we continue throughout that Old Testament story. But Paul is trying to say these things took place so that we won't do the same thing. All right? So many times we love to use that phrase of like, well, I have to learn it for myself. I have to learn it the hard way. Do you? Do we really? Like, we do, but should we? Okay? God is trying to say you don't have to learn the hard way. Learn from these examples. Take what happened to them and don't do the same thing. He reiterates it again a little bit later in verse 11. These things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. All right? So we're now in this great time with Christ, but we still can learn from what happened in the Old Testament. We can see what happened to them and go, you know what? It could still happen to me. I could be following Christ and be enticed away. I don't want that to happen. He's not saying specifically you're going to be hung on a pole and hung out in the desert and these things could happen to you, but falling away from Christ could, all right? The devil is still out there trying to trick and ensnare and entice. He's trying to make evil things look desirable. So be aware, learn from their mistakes. Going back up to verse 7, let's read that chunk right there. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, they rose up to play. We must not indulge in the sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. So now he's blending together some of the story y'all read last week and studied about and some of the story that we're reading this week. In both cases, they were putting God to the test, but Paul is saying Christ was the spiritual things they were partaking of this whole time. So they were putting Christ to the test, and we shouldn't do that either. If we're constantly in this state of, well, I think I can participate in this, I think I can do these things, we're testing Christ each and every step of the way. Some of you may have a verse that's come into your head. Anybody got Romans popping in their head right now? Romans chapter 6, okay? A couple of you are like, yeah, I kind of had that floating around. It sounds very similar to when he's saying, should we continue in sin so that grace can abound? And of course, his answer is no, okay? So many times the Christian ethic is, yeah, we may be able to participate in this, but is it the right thing to do? Should we participate in this? What are the negative outcomes both for me or for the people around me? And especially if it is truly evil and wrong, should I do it and then go, yeah, but God's grace, God's mercy, it's going to cover me and it shows how awesome he is that he lets me off the hook every time. And Paul's saying, that wasn't true then, that's not true today, okay? So he's trying to draw us to this point of, even though they had an immediate consequence, the ones that make us kind of a little squeamish, there are still consequences in a spiritual sense for us today, okay? So that's what he's trying to draw out. There's great mercy, there's great sacrifice, all of these things are true, but, verse 9, let us not put Christ to the test. Don't push it. You ever tell that to your kids? Don't push it. Don't push me. You know they haven't quite done it wrong yet, but they're getting close enough and you're trying to give them that warning. Don't do this. It's not going to be good for you. All right? That's his warning. Now we continue on because we go, okay, so it's just still warnings. It's more of this, okay, I got to do the right thing. No. It's more than just doing the right thing or the wrong thing. There are deep connections made. Remember it said that they were bound to, they were bonded to Baal of Peor, okay? He says the same thing is true when we as Christians today may try to fall into these evil temptations when we may not have learned from the instructions. So here we go. Let's go down to verse 20. Here, still in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 20. I imply that what the pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons, not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of the demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And of course the answer is no, like so many times when these sort of phrases are tossed at us. But he's saying this is a deep participation. It's not a casual sin or a little mess up. When we decide to give in to evil and be bonded to it and spend time with it, we are communing with demons. Now that makes us a little uncomfortable if we're not used to thinking about the spiritual realm and the spiritual world as a real thing. We like to think of this stuff we can touch, like, okay? I'm having communion with you if I'm across the table from you and I'm sharing a meal. That I understand. But when I'm doing evil actions, when I'm making poor choices, when I'm walking away from God, I'm communing with demons is a little harder to comprehend. But it is no less real. And Paul is warning us about these things. The Lord is a jealous God. The Lord is a God of one. He has called his people to worship him and him alone, and us being with Christ is no different. We are to follow Christ and Christ alone. And when we fall into these things, when we're tempted away, we are now communing with powers that are deeper than maybe we understand and see. So, all of those things mean that we don't walk a both and. We can't do it all. We can't have a little bit of the sin and a little bit of God. We can, like the Israelites, make our sacrifices to God and go make the sacrifices to Baal. You couldn't do them both. It was an either or. And God had made that clear time and time again, but people don't quite get it. And sometimes we don't get it today either. But that's kind of where we can make those parallels. That's where we can draw in. Why do we need to know about this horrible story? And again, if you want to read all the gory details, read on through Numbers 25, 26, and you can get even deeper into it. It's uncomfortable. Why is it there? That's when we can come ahead and look at 1 Corinthians and we can read, okay, those were things to teach us, to help us understand just how vital it is for us to worship God and God alone. Don't tempt Christ. Don't tempt God. Don't pull in jealousy, all these different things, okay? So hopefully that'll give you something to chew on and jump back and forth in. But as we're closing out class, I do want to end with how the narrative ends. So let's go back into Deuteronomy. Or go back into Numbers, sorry. Deuteronomy is where a lot of this next part takes place, but we get a glimpse of it here in Numbers. Numbers chapter 27. It's where Moses is appointing his replacement. And his replacement, going back to one of those great failures of the people, there were only two guys that stood up for God. There were only two guys that said, look, it may have this massive people group there, but we can do it through God's power. God will take care of us. One was Joshua, the other was Caleb. And Joshua is the one that is chosen by God to now be the new leader. And now here's where Moses appoints this leader. Let's start in verse 15 of Numbers 27. So Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the Spirit of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out, bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be sheep without a shepherd. Sounds fairly familiar to some of the things we've been studying on Sunday mornings, talking about the shepherd who will not leave us. Even in this transition, God is not going to forsake his people. He wants someone there to protect them, to guide them. So the Lord says to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hands on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest in him with some of your authority, that all the congregation of the people may obey. And he will stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgments of the Urim before the Lord. And his word shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and the people of Israel with him, the whole congregation. And so Moses did as the Lord commanded him. So we now have a new leader. And a little bit later this year, we're probably going to have some discussions about Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and maybe even a little bit into Joshua to explore what happens. But I just want you to highlight and understand that this is a transition point for the people of Israel. Even though Joshua was the appointed next leader, the same way we've seen kind of a diminishment in the way that the people would follow God from time to time, the leader was going to be different as well. And here's just a couple of the things. Joshua is going to have God's Spirit with him. Moses does lay his hands on him, publicly puts him in as the leader of the people, but Joshua is not going to have the open talking relationship. He's not going to speak mouth to mouth, face to face with God as Moses did. God says he's now going to go through the priests. He's going to listen to the priests after they've cast the lot. After they've inquired to God, then they will go to Joshua. It's just going to be a little bit different. Not worse necessarily, because God is still with them. God still cares for his people, but it's not going to be the same. And there's some implications to that. The way the people distrusted Moses, they're still going to have some distrust of Joshua from time to time. And you can imagine as a people group, If you distrust the guy whose face literally glows after he's been talking with God, after he's literally been up on a mountain in a massive storm that you go, how could anyone survive that? And you still distrust him, you can imagine the implications for someone who doesn't quite even have that level of access. The struggle for how much they would trust God and his leaders was something that was going to continue. And it's obviously something we still struggle with in our own ways today. And that's why we can tie into those passages in Corinthians and Romans and even in Revelation when we hear all those different things that were pronounced to the various congregations there. This is a narrative that, again, is here for us to learn from. And I hope that's what Exodus has been for you. Again, all the past lessons are there, and I would encourage you, if you want to, go back and look them up. Talk with Dan about those different things that come up. Talk with me about it, and we'll see where we can get. It's been fun to have a dive into this kind of at the last minute, but I'm thankful for the opportunity to close out Dan's class and kind of round out this discussion of Exodus and Numbers. Just as a heads up of what's coming in our class series moving forward. So starting next Sunday, in this class, I know Dan is giving y'all a little bit of heads up for what he's going to talk about, the case for the Bible in this modern world, postmodern world. He's going to be talking about a lot of those philosophical things that come up. I'm actually going to be teaching upstairs from the book of Matthew. We're going to talk about the structure of the book of Matthew and some of the major teaching sections of that book. Courtney and Sonia are going to be teaching the ladies' class in the conference room. They're going to be walking through the book of Romans. Specifically, I know they're going to take some word studies to understand what specific words in Romans mean, and then how do we apply those both to the understanding of Romans, but the living of our daily life. The teens will be talking about the Sermon on the Mount in their Bible class. And then on Wednesday nights, we've got one more Wednesday night in the current quarter. And if you're able to come, I would encourage you to do that. This Wednesday night is going to be another one of our singing nights. And we're going to continue on the last Wednesday night of each month having a singing night. All right, that'll be when we give the different guys opportunity to lead songs, for you to give requests. We'll keep doing that for the next several months on the last Wednesday night of the month. But on the other Wednesday nights, we're going to take what Dan is talking about on Sunday morning and take some more kind of practical or very specific examples of that and really dive into those on the Wednesday night discussion. So we're titling it, Can I Trust the Bible? And we'll talk about some specific things that maybe people question about the Bible or problems they have with it, whether it's the actual context of it or how it's been transmitted over the years. We'll talk about a lot of those things. And the teens will be having a class discussing on a little more introductory level, but that same sort of subject on the Wednesday nights. So we've got a lot of good things coming up. I hope that this class has been beneficial for you this quarter. I thank you for being here, but it's time for us to take a break, and then we'll be back for worship here in a bit. Thanks for being in class.